Hey there folks, and welcome to this video, and here I'm going to be talking about the Formula 1 2020 season, and I'm going to be doing this in some kind of chronological order, so let's strap in and have a look at what happened this season. Let's start off with preseason testing, and all kinds of different things happened around there. We saw that Mercedes weren't necessarily the furthest out in front and were struggling with some reliability issues, though they had brought an innovative new DAS system, the dual axis steering, which Red Bull certainly weren't keen about. Though, however, the biggest story I think that came from testing was Ferrari. We didn't know what had happened, but with the new engine regulations that had come in for 2020, they seem to have slowed down. Maybe because, as many are speculating, issues with the 2019 engine's legality might have come to the fore. In fact, about a week after testing ended, we found out that Ferrari had reached a settlement with the FIA regarding its 2019 power unit, and many of the teams had decided to protest against this. Of course, there wasn't going to be much in the way of Ferrari's performance. As we saw from testing, it was going to be a hard season for the Scuderia and the teams that it also supplied engines for, which were Haas and Alfa Romeo. However, we were getting closer and closer and closer to the season getting underway. That was going to be the Australian Grand Prix. However, as we got towards it, we found that the Chinese Grand Prix was going to be outright postponed, potentially cancelled for the season. Similarly, the Vietnam Grand Prix and the Bahrain Grand Prix, if it was to be going ahead the week after Australia, would do so without spectators. Restrictions on travellers from Italy, which would affect the likes of Alfa Romeo, Pirelli, and of course Ferrari and AlphaTauri, meant that it was quite a big question mark over whether the weekend was going ahead. Following a positive test result in the McLaren camp and several more team members isolating, F1 called a crisis meeting with the team bosses, after which some leverage was pulled within the companies that ran some of the teams to decide that the Grand Prix was to be cancelled. In addition to that, the Bahrain Grand Prix was cancelled, and we found out that the new rules were going to be delayed from 2021 to 2022. There were also more cancellations as we waited for the calendar to get back underway. Monaco was going to be flat out just cancelled from the calendar. At the same time, earlier rounds in the championship, the likes of Zandvoort, the likes of Baku, were going to be postponed. The same for Spain. Though later on, these would also look like they were going to get cancelled. F1 suggested that it was going to have a 15-race calendar in 2020, which, looking back on it now, I don't think we really expected was going to be true, but sure has been in the end. We saw the Canadian Grand Prix, the United States Grand Prix all being pushed back, and in the 28th of April, we got news that we were going to have the season starting in Austria with an 18-race calendar planned. It was going to be starting off with Europe, then going to the Americas, then Asia, then the Middle East. Or it was going to be Europe, Asia, the Americas, and the Middle East to round off the season. And as more and more was happening, more and more races were going to happen without spectators. We had already confirmed that Austria was going to happen with 2 Grand Prix, and the British Grand Prix and the 70th anniversary Grand Prix also came up at Silverstone. And then we were getting ready for the next batch of races that were going to be announced. And that's when we got towards the start of the season. However, ahead of the Austrian Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton made a statement about racism and racial inequality around the world, but also that he'd experienced in motorsport. In response to this and him calling out silence from those around him in the paddock, the FIA and Formula 1 announced initiatives such as End Racism and We Race as One. And ahead of the first Grand Prix at Austria, we saw 14 drivers kneeling in a display against racism. The 6 who didn't were the likes of Carlos Sainz, who found himself in hot water after allegations of racism, Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Daniel Kvyat, and the Alfa Romeo pairing of Kimi Raikkonen and Antonio Giovinazzi. Though that didn't necessarily distract from the on-track action. Instead, we saw all kinds of displays happening up and down the grid at the season opener. Mercedes were having to steer clear of the curbs to make sure they weren't going to shatter their gearboxes, something that seems to have befallen George Russell. Max Verstappen was out with mechanical issues early on in the race as well. Lewis Hamilton had to battle back from a demoted grid start, having raced under yellow flags during the qualifying session after Valtteri Bottas had gone off. He ended up finishing 4th place after a collision with Alex Albon, and it was a very clumsy weekend for the reigning world champion. Bottas picked up the win, and Lando Norris came home 3rd behind Charles Leclerc in 2nd. Didn't really expect that to happen for the Ferrari. Ahead of the Australian Grand Prix, the N-Race Sim display was covered up as the F1 World Feed cut to skydivers, leading to criticism from around the paddock. However, the race itself saw 2 Ferraris coming together incredibly early on, both of them being brought to retire as a result. But it seemed like Lewis Hamilton was back to his winning ways. He managed to pick up the pole position. He took that until the end of the race, with Bottas 2nd and Verstappen 3rd. The next week at Hungary, it ended up becoming a matter of a sort of organised mess as part of the N-Race Sim display. However, there was even more mess on the way to the grid. Max Verstappen found himself in the wall in Sector 3 on his way to the grid, not even on a formation lap. And the skill taken by the Red Bull mechanics to repair the car with broken suspension before the race started ended up helping him fight for a 2nd place towards the end. Lewis Hamilton was 1st, Valtteri Bottas 3rd, but one of the biggest stories of the Hungarian Grand Prix was with Haas and Kevin Magnussen. Magnussen picked up P10 in the end, and it was because of a genius call by Haas to start on different tyres to everybody else. As the weather seemed to be changeable, Haas took a gamble and they managed to go out longer and stay out longer in the race as well. As we head to the British Grand Prix, we ended up seeing the N-Racism display get its own kind of proper message. Kevin Magnussen joined the 6 drivers who elected not to kneel, having had a change of mind. And the biggest story of the British Grand Prix weekend was Sergio Perez being the first driver in F1 to contract the coronavirus. And he was replaced by Nico Hulkenberg, brought in by Racing Point. He ended up not starting the British Grand Prix, but he would return for the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, as Perez had to take at least 2 races out to recover. That said, the British Grand Prix was one which didn't really have as much action over the course of the race itself. Of course, we saw a massive crash for Daniel Kvyat through Magnus and Beckett. But the biggest drama came towards the end of the race. Tyre failures for Carlos Sainz and Valtteri Bottas, and on the final lap, for race leader Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen closing in fast, having taken a last-minute pit stop to try and save his tyres. But Hamilton came across the line on 3 wheels to win another British Grand Prix. A week later was the 70th anniversary Grand Prix and a compound softer tyres. That seemed to work against the Mercedes. Even though they picked up pole position with Valtteri Bottas and fastest lap of Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen was able to hold on to take a win for Red Bull Racing. And it was 2nd for Hamilton, 3rd for Bottas. Outside of that, we saw another strong 4th place for Charles Leclerc, who was even building on a 3rd at the British Grand Prix, with Alex Albon in 5th position. Nico Hulkenberg ended up finishing in 7th in his 2nd weekend of the season. And, well, we started to see more and more happening around the world of Formula 1. We ended up knowing that we were going to Mugello after the likes of Spa and Monza. And around this time, we also found out that we weren't going to be heading to the Americas in 2020. The Brazilian, American, Mexican, Canadian Grand Prix were all cancelled. However, F1 announced the return of Imola, the Nürburgring, and an introduction to the Algarve, to Portimao. The Portuguese Grand Prix was going to be back for the first time in nearly 25 years. Next up was the Spanish Grand Prix, and overtaking has long been an issue around the Circuit of Catalonia, the place that we saw preseason testing, but those kinds of woes that we saw some teams affected with the testing didn't seem to hold on. Mercedes has been talking about how the struggles they were having in preseason testing would have affected an Australian Grand Prix had that gone ahead. However, they were able to deal with these ahead of the actual season opener in Austria. And we saw that in their on-track performance. They took a 1-3 with Hamilton taking the win and Bottas taking third, though Bottas picked up the fastest lap. Verstappen second again. One of the biggest bizarre stories of the Spanish Grand Prix weekend? Well, that was around Charles Leclerc, who undid his seatbelts and drove around for a lap with his seatbelts loosened before going in to eventually retire the car. At the same time, we saw a massive crash in the weekend for the likes of Esteban Ocon, who was trying to, who got involved in a kerfuffle with Kevin Magnussen during free practice. As we went towards Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, we found out more news about the calendar and some more technical updates happening mid-season. F1 confirmed that the final 4 races of the calendar were going to be at Turkey, 2 in Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. But we also found out that party mode was going to be banned from Monza. That was massive stuff, as the season had seemed to be dominated by Mercedes, who they thought were running qualifying engine modes so much that it was a so-called party mode. This is something that's been dominant around the hybrid era, but of course the FIA sought to bring it back this season. The Belgian Grand Prix was quite a strong performance of Mercedes, though Daniel Ricciardo took the fastest lap in the Renault, and Carlos Sainz struggled to make the start of the race following technical issues on his McLaren. Again, the top 3 was Hamilton, Bottas and Verstappen. And you were asking, what's going to happen next? We were heading towards Monza, the Temple of Speed. Were Mercedes still going to be fast, or was this party mode reigning in going to have any kind of effect? Well, Mercedes weren't the outright fastest, though of course they did take pole position and the fastest lap of Lewis Hamilton, but instead, all kinds of heroics ensued. Lewis Hamilton picked up a time penalty for entering a closed pit lane when Kevin Magnussen retired, and after a red flag crash for Charles Leclerc, we ended up seeing Pierre Gasly taking an emotional first win. And we talk about 1996 already with Portugal. It was the first time since 1996 that a French driver had won a Formula 1 race. Pierre Gasly, the first driver since Olivier Panis to accomplish that feat. He held off Carlos Sainz and Lance Stroll to take his first win. What an emotional win. I remember crying, and I'm still emotional thinking about it now. That said, it wasn't exactly the most ideal weekend for Red Bull. Max Verstappen retiring for the first time in Italy this season, and Alex Albon finishing down in 15th place. Lewis Hamilton managed to claw back to P7 and Bottas in P5 as we headed towards Mugello for the first Tuscan Grand Prix, a second race in Italy and a second retirement in Italy for Max Verstappen, this time with a first lap crash that also took out our most recent race winner Pierre Gasly. Then we had a second red flag in as many races after a horrible crash on the safety car restart, taking out the likes of Esteban Ocon, taking out Carlos Sainz, Antonio Giovinazzi, Kevin Magnussen, Nicolas Latifi. And if that wasn't to be the end of it all, we saw another red flag crash, this time Lance Stroll. At the end of the race, it was Hamilton from Bottas yet again, but third place. And a first time on the podium, third time lucky, his third attempt at trying to get third, Alex Albon. However, it was that weekend that we found out that the Racing Point team, soon to be rebranded as Aston Martin, was not retaining Sergio Perez. Instead, they brought in Sebastian Vettel, who was dropped before the season even started by Ferrari, who had signed Carlos Sainz, in this whole kind of silly season mashup that saw the likes of Sainz going to Ferrari, Ricciardo going to McLaren, Alonso going back to Renault, and Vettel going across to Aston Martin. What was going to happen to Perez, we didn't know. Rumours were either Haas or potentially Red Bull. So that podium might have been quite good for Alex Albon. We then headed to the Russian Grand Prix, and it was disaster again for poleman Lewis Hamilton, who ended up doing practice starts at the wrong point in the pit lane and picked up a time penalty as a result. Valtteri Bottas was able to take a win on the track where he has performed arguably the best in his F1 career, with Verstappen taking second and Hamilton taking third place in the end. And there was a massive crash from Carlos Sainz in the first lap, which brought out a safety car, having done a crash trying to rejoin following going on at turn 2. But we also saw retirement for the like of Lance Stroll as well. As we headed towards the Eiffel Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton was set to equal a record. If he won at the Nürburgring, he would take a joint record with Michael Schumacher for most Grand Prix victories. And it wasn't just that happened at the Nürburgring. Nico Hulkenberg was back. He took over from Lance Stroll, who had to withdraw after feeling unwell, ended up testing positive for the coronavirus as well. But he ended up bringing himself quite a good finish, P8, having shown up on Saturday, not knowing he was going to be in a car. And he started last, finished 8th, got the Driver of the Day vote. But it was a win for Lewis Hamilton. Valtteri Bottas had engine issues, meaning he had to retire despite starting on pole position, and Max Verstappen finished 2nd. Perhaps the biggest feel-good story of the weekend, though, was Daniel Ricciardo, the guy who picked up fastest lap in Belgium and ended up getting a couple of 4th place finishes at Silverstone, at Spa, and also at the Tuscany Grand Prix at Mugello. He got his first podium since leaving Red Bull, Renault's first podium since their return to the sport, and it meant Cyril Abiteboul had to get a tattoo. Not that I think he's actually gotten it yet. Then it was heading off to Portimao for a first Portuguese Grand Prix, and it was one that saw several different events unfolding very early on in the race. Kimi Räikkönen with a massive jump at the start. Not jumping the start, but getting a lightning quick start as the track was a mix between wet and dry. Carlos Sainz briefly led the race before the Mercedes took back ahead, and that same top 3 that we've gotten so accustomed to came forward again. Lewis Hamilton getting pole and the fastest lap. Valtteri Bottas 2nd and Max Verstappen in 3rd. That meant that Lewis Hamilton then had the most wins out of any F1 driver in history. Then we headed to the next weekend to the Romania Grand Prix, and it was a 2-day weekend. Of course, the Eiffel Grand Prix didn't actually have any Friday running due to it being rained out, but this was one that was like that by design, and it didn't seem to hinder the Mercedes so much. Lewis Hamilton managed to win out from Valtteri Bottas. Bottas taking pole position, but Hamilton managing to make the most of a late virtual safety car. Later on, Max Verstappen retired, making that 3 from 3 in Italy, and that was because of a tyre failure putting him into the gravel trap. 3rd place? Well, remember who got 3rd in the Nürburgring? Daniel Ricciardo. Yeah, he was back at it again. A 2nd podium in 3 races. Does that mean a 2nd tattoo for Cyril? All we knew is it was a disappointing performance for Red Bull. Alex Albon again in 15th position. He span late in the race coming out of, I believe it was a Villeneuve chicane, and dropped way down the pack. As we headed to the Turkish Grand Prix, it became realistically the first opportunity for Lewis Hamilton to become a 7-time world champion. And you weren't really been able to tell that from practice and qualifying. A brand new track surface that hadn't been worn in meant it was incredibly slippery for the drivers, made even slippier over the course of Saturday and Sunday with wet weather playing a part. Who was on pole position? Well, it was Lance Stroll, taking it from Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen. And you couldn't feel happier for the Canadian. He ended up leading a lot of the race before a mistimed pit stop as well as damage to the car that they hadn't noticed beforehand put an end to that. However, the biggest charge came from Lewis Hamilton. He started well down the pack, though did get through to qualifying 3 and managed to deliver a convincing race win to be able to seal his 7th Drivers' Championship. Valtteri Bottas was down in 14th place, Max Verstappen 6th after both of them had numerous spins. Verstappen a high speed behind Sergio Perez, Bottas on several different occasions including collisions with other drivers. Who filled out the rest of the podium though? Well, 2nd place went to Sergio Perez. The Racing Point probably could have picked up a win had it been any luckier over the course of that weekend. But 3rd, that went the way of Sebastian Vettel. the 4-time champion finding his groove at the race where Mattia Binotto did not attend, causing people to speculate, was it Binotto that had that effect on Vettel? Vettel, of course, did get 3rd place in the final couple of corners at the end of the race, following a look-up and a run-on into the final couple of corners by teammate Charles Leclerc, who was attempting a late race dive at Perez. We then headed to the Bahrain Grand Prix, scene of probably one of the most frightening incidents we've seen in F1 for quite a long time. Romain Grosjean's Haas burst into flames on the first start, and miraculously he got out the car. But that was the end of his season, and the end, seemingly, of his time in Formula 1. Grosjean, with injuries to his hands, missed the final 2 races, and honestly, I wish all the best for him with his recovery. The guy really could have been a race winner. I remember watching a time when he was one of the best drivers out there. Back late 2012, early 2013. Perhaps even some earlier parts of 2012 as well. And if you hear the likes of Eric Boulier or Perman talking about it, they always rate Grosjean as a driver. When the race restarted, Daniel Kvyat, who unluckily made contact with Grosjean during that crash, ended up tipping over Lance Stroll on the restart, causing another safety car. But there were all kinds of other stories at the Bahrain Grand Prix. Sergio Perez, now classified 18th, was on course for another podium before his engine spectacularly blew up with only a couple of laps left to go. That meant that Mercedes took another win for Lewis Hamilton. 8th place for Valtteri Bottas, it was an unfortunate race for him. 2nd place for Verstappen, but 3rd, yet again, went to Alex Albon. And it seemed like, with 2 races left to go, Lewis Hamilton could pick up a clean sweep of race wins. However, ahead of the Sakir Grand Prix, drama as Lewis Hamilton himself tested positive for coronavirus, meaning that he had to be replaced in the Mercedes team. We didn't know if it was going to be Stoffel Van Dorn or somebody else. At the end of the day, it was George Russell who got the call-up, meaning that Jack Aitken got the call-up to Williams to start his first Grand Prix. At Haas, Romain Grosjean was replaced by Pietro Fittipaldi, being the 3rd generation of Fittipaldi to race in Formula 1. And what a Grand Prix the Sakir Grand Prix was, using the Bahrain outer circuit. Something that we didn't really expect to see. The first proper sub-minute laps, the fastest laps we were seeing in F1 history, the shortest lap times we were seeing in F1 history. And it went the way of Sergio Perez in the end. A spectacular win for the Mexican, who seemed to put some kind of signature on his future in Formula 1. For a man who started the race dropping back after a crash that claimed both Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, he fought back for a commanding win, with Esteban Ocon taking the podium for 2nd place for the French driver, and 3rd went the way of Lance Stroll. It was quite a weekend to remember, but one to forget for Mercedes. Poor pit stop cost both Bottas and Russell, and a late puncher hindered Russell even more. He got his first points in Formula 1, a 9th place finish, but it could have been so much more. But we've seen promise from the kid. He's going to be back for more. He's got to be. Then it was time for the finale. We didn't know if Hamilton was going to be back. In the end, he was. But he wasn't the number 1 on the day. Verstappen took pole and had a light to flag win. Didn't get the fastest lap in the end. That went the way of Daniel Ricciardo again. That was his 2nd fastest lap of the season, and the 2nd time he denied somebody some kind of Grand Slam in Formula 1. And 2nd place was Bottas. 3rd place, well, if it didn't make it clear who was going to be on the podium this season, it was Lewis Hamilton in 3rd. Meaning that, whilst it was close between 2nd and 3rd in the championship, and Sergio Perez, although he retired, claimed 4th, it was a commanding championship victory for Lewis Hamilton. And of course Mercedes, who could have won the Constructors' Championship on Lewis's points alone. And that's that. Wow, I don't believe we thought we were going to get 17 races earlier in this season, especially when they were saying, oh, it might be 15. I know I certainly didn't, but we ended up getting, what, 3 double headers at the same venue in Formula 1, including a new layout. We saw new tracks we hadn't seen before and we might never see again. We saw classics return to the calendar as well, in the likes of the Nürburgring. And I want to thank you all so much for watching, especially if you've got this far. I know it's a long video. It's taken a while for me to make here on New Year's Eve, but I wanted to make it sure it was out in time for the end of the season. So thank you for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you around. Bye-bye for now.